And consistently, whenever a financial crisis erupted, be it in Latin America, Asia, or the global meltdown of 2008, the prescribed solution remained invariably the same: print more money, borrow more extensively, and make more promises. Each successive rescue operation rendered the system larger in scale, yet paradoxically weaker in fundamental resilience. Each bailout merely postponed the inevitable reckoning, simultaneously guaranteeing that its eventual arrival would be far more severe. The world today operates not on the solid bedrock of gold or tangible production, but precariously on confidence, arguably the most volatile and ephemeral resource of all. So, what truly perished on that fateful night in 1971? It wasn't merely the gold standard. It was the fundamental idea that money should possess intrinsic meaning, that it should genuinely represent accumulated work, inherent scarcity, or tangible value. That night, money transformed into little more than a collective story, meticulously crafted by governments and, for now, believed by their citizens. It is a narrative that can only endure as long as the populace maintains its collective belief that the story's ending will ultimately be a happy one. Yet, history offers stark lessons, repeatedly demonstrating that every such story ultimately concludes in the same fashion. Imperial Rome debased its silver coinage. Revolutionary France engaged in rampant issuance of assignats. Weimar Germany resorted to printing ever more devalued marks. Every empire that has dared to replace real, underlying value with mere promises has, without exception, eventually confronted the unforgiving reckoning of lost trust. Nixon's announcement, therefore, was far more than a mere economic event. It represented a profound civilizational turning point. It marked the precise moment when abstract faith was substituted for tangible gold, when a powerful illusion usurped concrete reality. And belief, as history continually and sternly reminds us, is an inherently fragile foundation. The profound irony of the situation is that Nixon's primary objective wasn't to forge a new global empire. Rather, he was desperately attempting to preserve an existing, faltering one. In the immediate aftermath, the move undeniably worked. The U.S. successfully averted a looming financial crisis, markets temporarily stabilized, and America retained its coveted financial throne. But the true cost of this short-term salvation was merely hidden, silently deferred into the distant future, into our very own era. For when money loses its fundamental anchor, everything else in the financial and societal landscape inevitably begins to drift, untethered. Economic inequality widens dramatically. Asset bubbles inflate to precarious levels. Governments, desperate to fund ever-expanding promises, revert to the printing press with increasing frequency and abandon. The gold window never reopened because, in truth, it couldn't. The world had become irreversibly addicted to a financial system that intrinsically rewarded debt accumulation, rampant speculation, and sophisticated manipulation over the more traditional virtues of saving and productive output. The illusion was now absolute. Paper had become power, and power, in turn, resided in paper. In the subsequent decades, this radical new system profoundly reshaped the entire planet. The advent of the petrodollar arrangement inextricably linked global oil trade to the U.S. currency, further cementing its international dominance. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank evolved into powerful instruments of dollar diplomacy, extending loans denominated in dollars and frequently imposing policies designed to keep borrowing nations firmly within the dollar's economic orbit. Nixon's audacious move granted the U.S. newfound freedom to finance its military engagements, expand its welfare programs, and run burgeoning deficits without the prior constraint of dwindling gold reserves. The economy experienced boom and bust cycles fueled by inflation and readily available credit. By the 1980s, this burgeoning new financial orthodoxy had acquired a definitive name: the dollar standard. Instead of the dollar being backed by gold, the entire global financial system now, paradoxically, backed itself with the dollar. Every international trade transaction, every nation's reserve holdings, every global loan, all were denominated in U.S. dollars. The United States no longer solely needed to export tangible goods to maintain its economic dominance. It could, with newfound ease, simply export its currency. However, this freedom came with a profoundly darker consequence. When money can be created seemingly without limit, debt inevitably becomes an addictive force. Governments borrow promiscuously to secure electoral victories. Corporations accrue debt to repurchase their own stock, artificially inflating share prices. Families, struggling with stagnant wages, borrow merely to afford basic necessities. The critical distinction between genuine prosperity and mere illusion grows dangerously blurred. In 1971, the U.S. national debt stood at approximately $400 billion. Today, that figure has ballooned to over $34 trillion, a staggering hundredfold increase. Crucially, every single dollar of this colossal debt mountain is only possible because Nixon deliberately severed the dollar's link to gold. The rest of the world quickly followed suit. Europe abandoned its own gold pegs, and nations like Japan, Canada, and Australia universally adopted fiat money systems. By the 1980s, not a single major currency on Earth remained tethered to any tangible, real-world asset. Money, at its core, had transformed into an act of collective belief. And with that pivotal decree, the fundamental rules governing the world's financial architecture were irrevocably altered. Initially, the broader public barely registered the seismic shift. Life, outwardly, continued as before. Shops opened, and prices remained relatively stable for a brief period. However, within the rarefied halls of power, a truly seismic shift had occurred. With the gold anchor gone, all previous monetary limits vanished. Governments were now empowered to print, borrow, and spend without any inherent restraint imposed by physical reserves. Money no longer originated from the laborious extraction of precious metals or the tangible fruits of productivity. Its creation now sprang directly from the realm of politics. The true cost of this radical change was soon to be revealed throughout the 1970s. Inflation, unchecked, exploded. The cost of virtually everything, food, fuel, homes, cars, surged dramatically. To illustrate, in 1971, the average U.S. home cost around $25,000. By 1981, that figure had almost tripled. Oil prices quadrupled, and the dollar's purchasing power plummeted by more than half within a single decade. Ordinary Americans keenly felt the pinch at the petrol pump and in the grocery aisles. Yet, on Wall Street, a momentous new era was dawning, the age of unprecedented debt. When money is fundamentally untethered from a tangible asset like gold, it invariably requires a new anchor. The U.S. swiftly identified what it perceived to be the perfect substitute: trust. Trust that the government would competently manage this new, unbound system. Trust that the dollar would perpetually maintain its global acceptance. Trust, perhaps most dangerously, that debts could proliferate indefinitely, and, miraculously, the system would somehow always correct itself. In the short term, this perception of trust indeed seemed to hold. Soon, other key nations began to follow suit. Germany, Japan, and even America's close ally, the United Kingdom, started actively redeeming their dollar holdings for gold. The U.S. gold reserves began to diminish at an accelerating and alarming rate. Behind the closed doors of the Oval Office, Nixon's economic advisors grew increasingly panicked. The United States found itself on the precipice of a devastating crisis, poised to lose not just its gold, but, more importantly, the bedrock of trust that underpinned the dollar's global value. The government was confronted with an impossible dilemma: honor its binding promise and risk imminent financial collapse, or unilaterally dismantle the existing system and gamble that the world wouldn't entirely grasp the implications. Nixon, with characteristic boldness, chose the latter. On the fateful evening of August 15, 1971, millions of Americans settled down to watch their televisions, anticipating nothing more than the routine evening news. Instead, they witnessed President Nixon, seated at his Oval Office desk, delivering an announcement of utterly unprecedented significance. He calmly declared that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That solitary sentence, delivered with such deceptive calm, effectively brought thousands of years of established monetary history to an abrupt end. The crucial word, temporarily, was the carefully crafted deception that allowed the policy to be sold to the public and the world. Over 50 years later, that temporary measure remains very much in effect. Literally overnight, money ceased to be a tangible promise backed by a physical asset and instead morphed into a mere governmental policy. Untethered from gold, the dollar transformed into what economists term a fiat currency, money deriving its value solely from government decree. It played a crucial role in rebuilding a world shattered by war, fostering an era of burgeoning global trade. The dollar transcended its role as merely America's currency, evolving into the de facto global medium of exchange. Yet, beneath this facade of stability, insidious cracks were beginning to appear. The enduring viability of the Bretton Woods promise hinged on one fundamental condition: that the United States would strictly refrain from printing more dollars than its gold reserves could realistically back. And for a significant period, this financial discipline largely held. However, empires, by their very nature, often find temptation irresistible. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, America's global footprint expanded dramatically. It was busy rebuilding war-torn Europe through the ambitious Marshall Plan, engaged in costly conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, constructing vast networks of highways domestically, and even launching humanity towards the moon. All these ambitious endeavors demanded immense financial outlays, far more capital than the U.S. Treasury possessed in its gold vaults. By the late 1960s, the underlying arithmetic simply ceased to balance. While Fort Knox held approximately 280 million ounces of gold, the sheer volume of dollars circulating globally, held in banks, foreign reserves, and international accounts, amounted to more than double that gold backing. Foreign nations, particularly those with keen financial foresight, began to take notice. France was the first to decisively call America's bluff. President Charles de Gaulle, a figure famously distrustful of financial empires no less than military ones, boldly announced that France would cease holding U.S. dollars as reserves. Instead, he unequivocally demanded payment in physical gold. French ships quite literally sailed across the Atlantic to New York, loaded their holds with gold bars from Fort Knox, and returned home, creating a highly visible drain on U.S. reserves. In just one pivotal speech, delivered over a mere 20 minutes, the very nature of global money was irrevocably altered. This wasn't a seismic shift born from the chaos of war, nor the fiery fervor of a revolution. Instead, on a seemingly ordinary Sunday night in August 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and, with a single pronouncement, severed the last tangible link between currency and intrinsic value. That night, money, as it had been understood for millennia, ceased to exist. In its place emerged an entirely novel construct, an illusion so pervasive, so deeply ingrained, that the vast majority of people alive today have never once paused to question its fundamental nature. This narrative unravels the momentous day money died, the very night the United States executed what many consider the most audacious financial maneuver in modern history. Prior to 1971, the concept of money carried tangible weight and meaning. To hold a dollar was not merely to possess a piece of paper. It was to hold a legitimate claim, a solemn promise explicitly backed by physical gold. Specifically, for every $35, one could walk into any bank and confidently demand a full ounce of gold in exchange. This pivotal arrangement was formally cemented in the aftermath of World War II, at a modest hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The Bretton Woods Agreement, as it became known, formally established the U.S. dollar as the undisputed anchor of the entire global financial system. Every major currency, from the British pound to the French franc and the Japanese yen, was meticulously pegged to the dollar, which, in turn, remained firmly pegged to gold. The underlying principle was elegantly simple. Stability was guaranteed by a tangible metal, and financial discipline enforced through scarcity. Crucially, governments were prevented from conjuring value from thin air simply by printing more money. For several decades, this system functioned remarkably well. Half a century later, we are living squarely within the pervasive shadow of those consequences. Inflation that never truly abates, debt levels that are inherently unrepayable, and a global financial system utterly dependent on endless expansion merely to stave off its own collapse. And a generation has now come of age that perceives this state of affairs as entirely normal, simply because they have never known any other reality. Therefore, when you observe prices relentlessly rising, currencies persistently devaluing, or governments routinely printing trillions of new units of money, remember that this isn't a novel phenomenon. It is the enduring, reverberating echo of a monumental decision made in 1971, the very night the dollar was liberated from gold, and the world, paradoxically, became chained to it. Money didn't perish with a dramatic bang. It died, subtly and ironically, to the sound of applause. And that applause, it seems, has yet to truly subside. If this analysis has offered you a fresh perspective, please consider subscribing. For the answers to our present financial predicament are not hidden in some uncertain future. They are already unequivocally written in the annals of history.